India's links with the Middle East region are, of course, quite well established and have been so for some time. Just one example is that of energy. India has oil and natural gas interests in Iran and in the Gulf, and I believe about 50% of India's oil imports come from the Middle East. So India is amply engaged in the Middle East for a variety of reasons. Yet the focus of this afternoon's discussion is detached engagement, and we owe this clever and oxymoronic title to today's speaker, P.R. Kumaraswamy. So we're very happy to have him with us today. He's perhaps the world's chief authority on India's relations with the Middle East, and you should have his bio in front of you, so I'll be brief. He's a professor at JNU in New Delhi, and he's the author of a number of books and authors. His recent publications include the monograph Indo-Iranian Relations and the Arab Prism, and the books Caught in Crossfire, Civilians in Conflicts in the Middle East, and Islamic Attitudes to Israel. And he's currently completing a manuscript on India's Israel policy. And he has also served as a fellow at institutes in Israel and in India. So I cede the floor.
Thank you very much, and I feel I'm humble and honored standing before you and putting my ideas on that. I'm not an expert, and as Michael was saying, probably I know something about the subject. Expert is when I go to my grave, not before that. I thought that I have a long time to go there, but probably Michael wants to send me quickly. When I say engagement, we all know that India is much more actively involved with the Middle East than any time in the past, and it spreads both in it is not only political, it is economic, strategic, energy, and whole range of issues. What is more interesting, India's policy now, that is in the post-Cold War, than before, was that it is less rhetorical. And I often think Jesus Christ must be a Indian, because we are very fond of sermonizing others. And if you look at the way in which India behaved during the Cold War, we almost, on every occasion, this should be done, that should be done, we no longer do that. And not because that we made a fundamental transition into being a nice guys, but basically we recognize our limitations. And with the result, you will find that during the Cold War, our policies are basically political, in the sense anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism, third world solidarity. These were the only means we were trying to promote our interests in the Middle East. And today it's no longer a viable proposition. You need to have much more than words to convey or to communicate your interests. I think that is what's happening in the last 10 years or so, when your relations with these countries are manifested through tangible decisions and policies and actions that India has taken in the last 15 years or so. And it is in that context I use the word engagement. Detachment is probably because we understand our limitations, that when you promote a relations with one set of countries and it is in conflict with another one. So therefore there comes a point you are forced to take a choice or take a side, and we are not in a position to do that. And I think that is what I'm saying. On the one hand, we are willing to collaborate and cooperate with a whole range of countries. There comes a point when we do not want to get involved in the problems that these countries have with some of the neighbors and others. So at one level, you want a closer relationship with these countries. At other level, you don't want to get sucked into their problems with the outside world. I think that is why it's a very peculiar development, largely because you do not have the power to change events, and therefore it is better you don't even get involved in that. And that is how I see the India's Middle East policy. And the first and foremost we should remember is that Middle East is more important to India than vice versa. Let there be no mistake on that. India is still a marginal player in the Middle East, in every sense of the word, political, economic, military, strategic. The converse is not true. If you look at the trade figures as of March last year, we don't know what's going to be this year. We all know from in every other part of the world. And at least till last year, Middle East played a dominant role. Our overall foreign trade was something like $400 billion, out of which $100 billion was with the Middle East. In other words, Middle East contributes 25% of our total trade, export, imports put together. And if you look at in terms of domestic politics, if we exclude the immediate South Asian region, Middle East is the most dominant foreign policy discourse in India, as manifested by the controversy surrounding normalization of relations with Israel and now the tension with Iran on the other hand. So if you look at it, Middle East is more important to us than other way around. It is economically important in terms of trade. It is important in terms of energy. If you look at the Indian energy market, in the 1980s, we were actually taking care of 2/3 of our energy needs through to domestic production. Today, the picture is the opposite. Nearly 2/3 of our energy comes from outside. If you look at any assessment, whether it's the Government of India, International Energy Agency, or the Energy Department of the US, everybody agree on one thing, that is by 2020, 80% or more energy of India will be met only by imports. At least in that front, that is in terms of energy dependence, I'm in the league with Japan. I can't compete with Japan in other areas, at least as far as energy dependence is concerned. Yes, guys, I'm also in your club, take me as a member. And something which I can't do in other areas. And the third thing, if you look at it, we have a substantial Indian expatriate population. We have about 5 million people as of last year, and bulk of them were in the Arab Gulf, the Arab countries in the Persian Gulf region. The remittance is enormous, anything between $25 to $30 billion annually, which is substantial. You have 500,000 population, and the dependence in India, you have a huge economic linkages between the two. And in terms of geostrategic consideration, Middle East is much closer, and you have all sorts of problems associated with that. And if you look at most of the problems which dominate today are one way or another related to the Middle East, whether it's the situation in Iraq, or the nuclear problems in Iran, or the problem of piracy in the Somalian coast. So all the Middle East gets attention for all the wrong reasons, all bad reasons. And you no longer look Middle East as the citadel of the three ancient religions. Today it's known for all the wrong reasons. Everything that goes wrong, you can always find it in the Middle East. So Middle East is more important for us than other way around. How are we handling it? Let me take 3 broad issues and then examine our policies, how we are handling or managing these issues. If one looks at the Arab countries, largely the Arab countries and the Persian Gulf are extremely important to us. Even though we talk Arab in a much general term, it is the Persian Gulf which takes a dominant place. Our expatriate labor is predominantly located in the Persian Gulf countries. There are few in Libya, but bulk of them were in the Persian Gulf countries. And our trade, for instance, with Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates is more than $50 billion. It looks funny, actually. In United Arab Emirates, the total population is 500,000. But the Indian trade with these guys are $23 billion. So therefore, it is an enormous economic interest between these two countries. And with the result, the Arab countries have always been important to us. In the Cold War times, we tried to promote our relationship by playing up the Palestinian card, saying that we are pro-Arab because we are a pro-Palestinian, therefore you have to be nice to us. And it is within that context we try to develop our relations with the Persian Gulf. And we continue to do that even though the Palestinian question has taken a backseat in the last few years. So what has happened is, if you look at India's interaction with these countries, both economic and political, it has been extensive for the last 15 years or so. Every major leader in the Persian Gulf were in India at some time or the other. You have a much stronger, vibrant relationship which is less political, less polemical, less rhetorical. The second country which you should look at is Iran. It is both good and bad. In India, people often talk about civilizational links with Iran. If you think civilization began in 1991, I have no problems with that. But if you look at seriously speaking, civilization was rarely a factor in Indo-Iranian relationship. It's very nice to know that the language of the princely state of Hyderabad was Persian. We have a long historical linkages in terms of culture, in terms of architecture, everything is fine. But where they transformed into political relationship, they are not. If you look at from 1947 till 1980, under the Shah, we had a problem in the form of Cold War, which means Shah was pro-United States, we were pro-Russian, so therefore there is very little convergence of interest. So the kind of military relationship Shah developed with CENTO and SEATO and everything, we were nothing in common with them. So the Shah's decision for Indian Ocean being an Iranian ocean, and all these things simply kept Shah at a distance. We had relations with Iran, we had normal relationship with Iran, but it was never close. And then you had a Pakistani factor to that. Pakistan being a friend of Iran also complicated the matter for us. In the Islamic Republic of Iran after 79, you had a different sets of problems. With all the differences, both the Congress party and the BJP talk about secularism. For the BJP, secularism is good, but what the Congress is doing is a pseudo-secularism. So they are fighting over the definition of secularism, not the substance of need for a secularism as a framework for Indian policy. So if you look at India as a secular country, what do we have in common with an Islamic republic? Ideologically speaking, there is nothing. On the other hand, India had a lot of things common with Iraq, especially under Saddam Hussein. It may be very unpleasant to recognize that India and Iraq had a lot of things in common than most people recognize that. The Ba'athist party was much closer to the Congress party, and its secular Arab nationalism was much in common with the Indian view of secularist worldview. With the result, you never had a kind of tension between India and Iraq. And Iraq supported us on the question of Pakistan. Iraq supported us with regard to oil prices after the oil crisis. So with the result, you have a whole range of convergence of interest between India and Iraq during the Cold War and even after 1979. With the result, India never condemned who was responsible for the Iran-Iraq war. This is one of the grudges Ayatollah Khomeini had against India. Everybody knew that Iraq was an aggressor, but you never said it. Which is rather surprising, because if you look at Indian behavior, we were one of the first countries to condemn Israel every time. In 1967, we said Israeli aggression in May, 3 weeks before the war actually started. So that is how we were I think we had a foresight in recognizing who is an aggressor before everything starts. But when it comes to Iran-Iraq war, we couldn't do that because Iraq was our friend. And that friendship went to a very unusual levels in 1990. When Iraq invaded Kuwait, India more or less accepted the Iraqi invasion, occupation in Kuwait. How do I say that? In August, we shut down our embassy in Kuwait and told our diplomats, go to Baghdad. I don't think any other country could have done that, and we did that. Why? Because Iraq was our traditional friend, and therefore we simply could not or did not want to antagonize. Similarly, in 1982, Iraq was supposed to host the Non-Aligned Summit. And a lot of countries were not willing to come to Baghdad because of the ongoing war. So what did Mrs. Gandhi do? Let me host a summit. So the summit in Iraq was shifted to New Delhi, and India hosted it in 1983. So you had a lot of interest baggage which brought India closer to Iraq. With the result, from 1947 till 1990, Iran was a country, a friendly relationship. It was never a close, cordial friendship that India had with the Arab world. Put it other way around. When it comes to Arab and non-Arab country, in the entire Middle East, India always sided with the Arabs. Whether it's a question of Arabs versus Turkey, or Arabs versus Iran, or Arab versus Israel. Because it is with the Arab world you had a much larger, tangible relationship. Therefore, if you are pushed to a situation, India always sides with a non-Arab country because that is where its interests lie. It was only after 91 you had a shift in India's policy towards Iran. Few things happened. end of the Cold War, which basically meant you lost Saddam Hussein. So you needed someone with whom you could deal with, who was a major player in India's Middle East policy. Iraq was doing that role after Nasser. So if you look at from 1950 to till 1970, Nasser was our major partner in the entire Middle East. Once Nasser was out of the scene, Sadat could not do that, carry on that job. So therefore, Iraq became the player with whom we had a major interaction. But after Kuwait, Iraq was removed. Iraq was removed politically. Iraq was removed even in terms of energy. And we needed a player who could deal with us at a much larger level. Similarly, Iran was also undergoing a change. Khomeini has died. Iran wanted a reconciliation with the outside world. It was only in the late 1980s Iran was making a fundamental shift towards the outside world. The confrontation was over. The export of revolution was over. They were willing to reconcile with the Arab countries. If you look at it today, it may look like a joke, but the 1980s were dominated by Salman Rushdie controversy. Towards the end, they quietly resolved it through mutual, everyone had their own interpretation, they resolved the problem. Iran took the step of reconciling with Saudi Arabia. So it was behaving in the sense much more normal fashion. So from the late 80s onwards, Iran reconciled with the outside world with two notable exceptions. One was Israel, with whom it had a historical religious baggage, so therefore Iran could never overcome that. Probably it thought that the raison d'etre of the revolution lies in taking an anti-Israeli position. So therefore the reconciliation never happened. The second was United States. There were ups and downs, there were movements, but the reconciliation never happened. But otherwise, if you look at today's Iran, Iran has reconciled with the entire outside world with the exception of Israel and the United States. So Iran was friendly towards neighbor, especially towards its Arab neighbor, which made things a lot easier for India. So India was looking for a friend, Iran was looking for a friend. It is in that context the Indo-Iranian relationship started developing. If you look at all the major state visits which took place, they all began after 91. First, Narasimha Rao goes to Iran, then Rafsanjani comes to India. Then Vajpayee goes to Iran, then Khatami comes to India, and last year we hosted for a very brief time, Ahmadinejad was passing through India on the way back from Sri Lanka. So all the developments took place only after 1991, not before that. And Iran played a number of roles. Iran was important because we had an identical views on a number of issues. Even for the Iranians, Taliban was an extreme. So therefore, there was an interest. We were anti-Taliban. There was a convergence of interest. Both the countries cooperated on supporting Northern Alliance. So Iran being a major player in the OAC means I have someone to talk to in the OAC against Pakistan. So you have a whole range of convergence. Gradually you had Iran being an access to Central Asia. These are the political developments. Then you have an economic ones. And Iran needed Indian market. Because when you talk about energy security, it operates at two levels. One, the countries importing energy need assured supply of energy. Similarly, those who are exporting energy also need an assured market. One without the other won't work. So therefore, Iran needed Indian market. But India also needed Iran. Because if you look at Iran, Iran is the only country which has both natural gas and petroleum. Other guys have only one or the other. Iran has advantage of being both. So therefore, Iran had a large energy resources. And India needed that in a much significant fashion. Because if you look at 91 onwards, our energy demands increased, so you needed long-term energy arrangement. So Iran became a major player if India were to look at long-term energy needs. But all the energy needs that India had with Iran had a problem. Whether you talk about LNG, whether you talk about IPI, or whether you talk about India's energy exploration in Iran, all of them are problematic in some form or the other. The pipeline was never given a serious thought until 2003. The idea came in late 1980s, people talked about it, academics discussed it, but it never became an Indian policy because of the fear over Pakistan. In 2003, the government of India said, okay, Pakistan is not a major problem, part of the Lahore process, therefore let's deal with this. Only then it became a viable proposition. And if you look at it, it was only after that US began to notice the energy link between India and Iran, not before that. Because pipeline gives you a different dynamics. India importing X amount of oil from a country doesn't bother the United States. But the moment you bring in a pipeline, it is a much larger, tangible, strategic form of relationship. And that is where US began to play a much active role in opposing that. And the second thing was LNG. Under the deal, Iran was supposed to supply 5 million tons of LNG every year. The problem was Iran doesn't have a LNG technology. So you sign a deal hoping that the Indian counterpart will somehow find an energy using its influences in the West. It never happened. So therefore, LNG deal is almost written in good faith, didn't carry out. And the third one is exploration. Exploration is basically aimed at having an energy assets abroad. India's intention was you explore an oil, you have a large quantity of oil, either you can swap it with a third party or bring it to India. That was the whole rationale of exploration. And it is in that context India has indulged in a whole range of energy exploration markets. We have invested over $2 billion in Russia, same amount in Sudan, and we are exploring energy in a whole range of countries. Burma or Myanmar, Syria, Egypt, Nigeria, you name it. You have a whole range. But none of them draw international attention. Why? Nice guys finish last. If you're a nasty guy, you get the headlines. Whether you deliver or not, you get the maximum attention no matter what is the financial implications of the relationship. So Iran got the maximum attention even though Indian oil companies could never bring these discovered oil to India. Indian companies would at best be given a percentage of money for their activities, not in terms of energy assets. So if you look at it seriously, all the energy deals are problem. At the same time, the much more serious problem came in the form of United States. Because US had a problem with Iran on two fronts. One, the energy front. The other one was the nuclear one. And it is the nuclear one which got us into much more serious problems. Because having gone nuclear, India cannot ask other guys, please don't go that way. We don't have the moral authority to do that. At the same time, you can't say more the merrier. Because the moment you say it, your monopoly goes. So you are in a very, very tight corner. So what India did was, Iran should resolve its differences within the IAEA, which is a very technical and very safe game to play, because you made a commitment, live up to that. And it is in that context we navigated the policy. And that was also not very smartly handled, as we know in the IAEA voting. So in the sense, if you look at the second voting, we voted against Iran, and the official statement was pro-Iran. We gave an impression that India was supporting Iran. Unless you look at the voting picture, it's the other way around. So we messed it up, but the logic was this. Iran's position was increasingly become untenable. No matter what Russia and China say in private or in public, look at the voting behavior. It is ultimately that is what matters. Because Iran said, Iran is a peaceful intention, everything. Then why did you vote with the United States both in IAEA and United States Security Council? Because if you look at IAEA, in the first vote, Russia and China abstained. Second vote, they voted with the rest of the majority. If you look at the United Security Council, all the 5 occasions, they voted with the United States. And US also took that walk, because they could have got a much harsher resolutions, much more effective resolution, but they recognized that would have been opposed or vetoed. So therefore, US was willing to dilute the resolution, but they conveyed one simple message, 15-0. That is the message US wanted to convey to Iran. So no matter what Russia and China said, eventually they went with the United States. I think that is what India recognized. In the sense, on the nuclear question, you got into trouble. It's an entirely different story that we completely mishandled the whole equation. Because you wanted a civilian nuclear cooperation with the United States and energy security from Iran. But we eventually did not convince either of the parties. We mishandled. We will go it if anyone is interested. But the most interesting thing for us is the Arab-Israeli question. And I think that is what is going to is tell us how India has been shaping its policy towards the region, And I would say more than the Persian and the Arab component, it is on the Arab-Israeli question, India has handled it reasonably well. I think they were able to articulate their positions without actually saying so in so many words. If you look at the Indian policy, largely towards Israel, till 92, it never had a diplomatic relations. From 1920 till 1992, you approach the whole question through a zero-sum game approach. You wanted to be pro-Palestinian, pro-Arab, which naturally meant you taking an anti-Israeli, anti-Jewish, or anti-Zionist positions. In 1920 onwards, Indian nationalists identified with the Palestinian Arab positions. Part of the problem is because you looked at the whole question through an Islamic prism. Because that is why you never recognize why a group of people strongly feel about a land where they left 2,000 years ago. You can say it's right and wrong, that's a different story. But the question is, first recognize the longing or a sense of attachment towards the land. That is the reality. Whether you agree, disagree, approve, disapprove, that's all secondary point. India never understood why a group of people wanted a homeland in Palestine. They never understood the logic of it. So therefore, why? Because you never looked at it. If you look at the Indian writings, Jazirat al-Arab, the land of Arabia, included Palestine. If you look at the Middle East context, they never included Palestine into that concept. It was Indians who argued it. If you look at Mahatma Gandhi, was more honest than most of the Indians, actually said Palestine is a Waqf property. Prophet Muhammad promised to them, therefore they cannot take it away. And he even said that in the First World War, Muslim soldiers of the Indian army did not shed blood to hand over Palestine to non-Muslim control. Okay, Indians talked in secular terms. It was Gandhi who said it bluntly. Palestine is an Islamic question, therefore I need to support the Arabs' Palestinian position, not the Jewish-Israeli position. So we continued that until the end. In 1947, when the bulk of the world was talking about partitioning Palestine, India said, no, federal Palestine. It's a good idea. The only problem was, Mahatma Gandhi said the same thing to India. Have a federal India with Jinnah as a prime minister. Nehru said, no, thank you very much. And that is the great hypocrisy. You think that the federal solution is good for Palestine, something which you can't do in India. The funny part is, in Palestine, communist parties, there were two communist parties. Communists, we talked about ideology transcending boundaries, could not find one platform that would unite Jews and Arabs. And therefore, in 1947, the only issue in which the Arabs and the Jews agreed was to reject the Indian federal plan. And they never agreed on anything else. On this one, they said, thank you very much, we don't want it. For the Arabs, it offered the Jews too much or more than what the Jews deserve. For the Zionists, it says, I was asking for sovereignty, you give me civil rights. So with the result, for the Arabs, it was too much, for the Jews, it was too little, therefore they rejected it outright. Until today, the Indian federal plan was never discussed anywhere outside India. Only in India, people talk it's a wonderful plan, it would have solved all the problems. Then you ask a question, if it is so good, why both sides rejected it? These are uncomfortable questions, so don't ask it. So in 1948, in 47, when the partition came, India was one of the very few non-Muslim countries to vote against Palestine, to partition of Palestine. In 49, when in 48 Israel came into reality, you can't ignore it. But still in 49, when Israel applied for the UN membership, you said no. That's one of the very few occasions India voted against a country's admission into the United Nations. In spite of all the things, you cannot ignore the reality. So 1950, you said, okay, I recognize Israel. If we look at the official records in 1950, there were explicit decisions that we will have full, normal diplomatic relations with resident missions in both countries. Nehru actually asked the ministry to prepare a budget for a resident mission in Tel Aviv. When Israeli diplomat Walter Yatan came to India in 1952 March, Nehru told him, yes, we will have relations, but we are in the middle of an election. once the elections are over, we will have a cabinet, we will ratify it, we will send the ambassador. We did send ambassador 40 years later. In 1956, after the Suez crisis, Nehru said, time is not ripe. He was angry at the Israeli action, not because of the Israeli invasion of Egypt, no. So many third world countries invade other countries, they even absorb them, swallow them, whatever it is. That's not a problem for him. For him the problem was Ben-Gurion collaborated with the British and the French, who still had an imperial interest, who were still imperial power, who were still behaving in an imperial fashion. Therefore, it was unacceptable to him. So in 1956, he said, no, that continued. By then, you also had Nehru-Nasser friendship. Between 1954 to 1964, when Nehru died, both leaders met as many as 14 times. So every time Nehru used to go to Europe, he will make a stopover in Cairo, and both the leaders will take a cruise along the Nile. And they exchange hours together. So that had an enormous influence on India's Israel policy. And this continued till 1992. And it reached its nadir, its lowest point in 1975, when India joined hands with the rest of the world, or rest of the third world, to say that Zionism was racism. And that's the lowest point you could go on the bilateral front. In 1992, the world changed, because you recognize Soviet Union disappeared. Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc countries provided the ideological basis of India's Israel policy. They were not responsible, but ideologically it proved politically correct to say that, okay, you're anti-Israeli, pro-Arab. And that can be seen even today in my campus. Every time there is a student union elections, people fight as if you think that Sharon or Olmert or Bush are going to fight elections. Because that is what you see on the posters. Because I can't solve the problems of hostels, water, library facilities, computers, network, tuition fees. No, I can't solve them. So let me solve the problems of the Gaza, problems in Venezuela, problem in Nicaragua. Okay, I can't solve that, I can't solve this. But you won't ask me to solve the problem, right? But if I promise you water and everything, you'll ask me next year what happened. You promise just next year. So therefore, it is still there. It is politically correct, it is politically fashionable to take the left attitude. And that is why, if you look at it, while the left was not responsible, it provided the ideological basis for the long absence of relations with Israel. In 1992, Soviet Union disappeared. So you don't have anybody to go. So you need to come to terms with certain basic realities. And the most interesting thing was, the Arabs were willing to talk to Israelis. So the Madrid process did not achieve anything. But it told us one thing: you need a political settlement. Political settlement means negotiations. Negotiation is give and take. So you won't get everything. So if Arafat is willing to talk to the Israelis, either directly or as a joint Jordanian-Palestinian delegation, what is my problem? Why should I be more Catholic than the Pope? And therefore India recognized, okay, there is no base, because I don't have a bilateral problem with Israel. My problem is partly because this is what the Arabs are saying, okay, my interest was with the Arabs, therefore I should do it. So in that context, India's, the basis of the policy completely changed. And that is how you have a normalization in 1992. But it also told us one thing: the zero-sum approach completely vanished. You recognize it is possible and it is necessary to have good relations with both sides to the conflict. What was the greatest contribution of the Russians to the Arab-Israeli conflict? Breaking of relations in 1967. Then what did you do? From 1967 to 1991, you're nowhere. You simply abandon your role. So if you are learning from something, even if I disagree with something, if I have to be taken seriously, at least I should be talking to both sides, or at least giving an impression that I am balanced. So the balance became the basis of India's Israel policy after 1992. It doesn't mean I abandon everyone. No. We'll come to that a little later. But the idea was you have established a balance in dealing with the Middle East. Since then, you have an enormous relationship between the two countries, political, economic, and everything. You have high-level visits. The climax was 2003, when Prime Minister Ariel Sharon comes to Delhi. And if you look at it, at that time, Belgium was actually talking about war crime trial against the Prime Minister. Not many Western countries are willing to host him. In spite of all the protests and everyone, India simply had a red carpet welcome to him. And the funny part was, two mainstream parties, the BJP and the Congress, recognized that visit. Sonia Gandhi met the Israeli Prime Minister as leader of opposition. And that is what matters. At the end of the day, the largest political forces in the country had reached a position. There is a bipartisan consensus on Israel. And even the communist leaders visited Israel in 2000. So if you look at it, until the Intifada, which created much problems later on, you had a view in India, no matter what, bilateral relations is good for both countries. And that is how happened politically. An economic front, you had an enormous trade between the two countries. Still there is a scope. It stands at about $4 billion. If you look at it at 1990, it was $80 million. From 80 to 4 billion, it's a huge leap, something no country has ever achieved in their bilateral relationship. The most interesting thing is happening where no country wants to talk about it, the military. As of March, Israel is India's largest arms exporter. Similarly, India is Israel's largest arms market, which is rather surprising, because in the Israeli case it's not surprising, because after 1980s, large number of markets have actually disappeared. Latin America, South Africa, Taiwan, for a whole range of issues, including China. So India becoming number one market in Israel is not a problem. The problem is the other way around, because 80% of India's defense establishment depends on the Russian model, number one. So to overtake Russia under those circumstances is not a joke. The second most interesting thing is Israel does not export platforms. No tanks, no missiles, no planes or ships. It is only avionics, small arms, missiles and other areas. In spite of the limitations, Israel has emerged India's largest arms supplier. So in that sense, that will tell you the ground reality. When it comes to military, even the sky is not the limit. We thought normally sky is the limit, even it looks like even that is not the case. Because in February last year, India launched a satellite of Israelis. And if you look at the media reports, everybody was very explicit. If and when Israel takes a military offensive against Iran, that satellite will be useful. India knew this, knowingly India launched it, which tells you that it is not only a cash and carry affair, you're willing to take the next logical step. Yes, if you're going to take my security into your account, I'm willing to do the same thing. I may not do everything you want, yes, but there are issues in which I could take that extra length and be counted on the subject. I think that is how the bilateral relations stand. But there is a flip side to that. The bilateral relations have increased over time. This has not changed India's basic position on the peace process. If you look at it, India has not abandoned the Palestinians. If you talk it, it's a two-state solution, Palestinian state, sovereignty, everything. If you look at a whole range of issues, refugees, border, fence, everything, Indian position is exactly opposite of the Israeli official position. There is no convergence of interest. If you look at the United Nations General Assembly, India still votes with the Arab majority, with the Palestinians. This is one of the major complaints Israel is making against India. You have a good relations, you have a close relation, but yet it is not transformed into much visibly in the General Assembly, other international forums. There was one exception, that was the Durban One. In spite of the public threat and pressure from the Arab countries, India simply said, we will not support your decision to equate Zionism with racism. We did it in 1975. We made amendments in 1991. We are not going to take the same course again. So in 2001, just days before the 9/11, India was not willing to support the Arabs on the Zionism demand. And that's a major departure from the past. In normal circumstances, India would have simply joined the hands. Will India do the same thing this time, this month? I'm not sure about it. My only gut feeling is that we will be so preoccupied with the elections, so nobody will have any time for the foreign affairs. That's the only thing one could think of. But what do I read it? At a bilateral level, India is prepared to have a solid relationship with Israel on every front, without exception. We are developing actually joint missile defense at an estimated cost of $2.5 billion. This is the largest defense deal India has ever signed. Single deal with any country in the world. And we are willing to cooperate with Israel across the board. You name the field, we will do it. But on the peace process, we have strong differences with Israel. I think this is what India is trying to do. There is a difference between bilateral relationship and the peace process. One is independent of the other. In 1939, the British came out with a white paper, and which more or less abandoned the Balfour Declaration. And the Zionist leadership in Palestine could not know what to do with that. They came out with a very fascinating strategy. Because that was a time when Hitler was on the rise, and you had to contain Hitler, and the only country which is containing Hitler was Britain, Churchill. So they came out with a statement. We will fight the war, that's the war in Europe, as if there is no white paper. And we will fight the white paper in Palestine as if there is no war in Europe. The same thing India is trying to do. We will support the bilateral relations as if there is no problem in the peace process. We will deal with the problem in the peace process as if there is no bilateral relations with the two other. And this is something India has been doing in the last 4 or 5 years. So from zero-sum game, you had a balance, and now you are getting into much more complex game. You are delinking the two and trying to have what I would call non-parallel interest. If only India is doing this, it's not a problem. As we said, India is not a major player in the Middle East. Okay, you do your own problem. Okay, we are not able to do that in Iran yet. Okay, India is trying to dealing the bilateral relationship and the peace process. What's the problem? Looking at things in the United States from India, I feel that Obama is going to do the same thing. Intensifying cooperation with Israel and even strengthening it over a period of time, but still disagreeing with Israel on the peace process. I think that is what India is trying to do. This perhaps is going to be the much visible face in the US policy towards the Middle East. Even though it's outside the purview, that is the only way India doing the same thing becomes relevant. Otherwise it's useless, because India is a marginal player. What India does it doesn't affect. But the idea is, when you look at Martin Indy's statement about the era of free checks is over, and that is why one reads it. But the good thing is, as a friend, as someone who wants to be a friend, things may not be said in public. Things will be said in a very subtle way, saying that is how I look at even the Indian behavior. In the sense, we don't say our disagreements much more visibly than in the past. If you look at even the Gaza statement, we were critical of Israel without mentioning a word about Qassam. We said, yes, both sides should accept ceasefire. Both sides should avoid targeting civilians. So which is a very subtle way. You can't say Hamas because of domestic compulsions. At the same time, you are no longer prepared to do this one-sided business which you are used to do in the past. This is how India, that is why I say at one level you are willing to engage with Israel. And on the peace process, you are willing to disengage. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. That was quite an interesting presentation. I imagine that many of you will have questions. Since we're broadcasting this over the internet, webcasting, you're gonna have to wait until a microphone arrives. And actually, while we're waiting for that to happen, I'm just going to ask a question first while we're waiting for the important person to distribute the microphone. In the context of India's energy diplomacy in the Middle East, but I guess this could be about India's diplomacy generally in the Middle East, to what extent do you think its actions represent an effort to counter or to meet the efforts that China has made? In other words, is there any sort of effort to counter China's influence? I'm thinking of Iran in particular, but perhaps elsewhere as well.
There are a few things one should know. We ignored China for a very long time. If you look at until the nuclear test, it's always Pakistan. And after the nuclear test, we need to rationalize. You can't do it within the Pakistani context. So the maximum before the nuclear test Indian leaders were prepared to say was, Pakistan is not the only threat. So you have to identify the second one. It could be Korea, it could be Mongolia, it could be Timbuktu. So they never said openly. So Pakistan is not the only threat. But it is only after the nuclear test you will find China becoming the much more visible in the Indian thinking, at least in public discourse. But there is a tendency in India to overdo this. It's almost, it's an unnecessary comparison with every single thing China does. A couple of days ago, Indian Foreign Secretary said, we are opening up the archives of material pertaining to China. That's fine. We should have done it 30 years ago. And what he said was, China has done it, we could also do it. I said, no, if you are going to look China as an example of declassifying material, there is something fundamentally wrong with your democracy. And so we have this habit of going on China. I'm not saying it because of my Chinese wife, please. Let me be very straight on that. My wife is a Chinese, and I met her in Israel. I met her at the Hebrew University. Our matchmaker was an Israeli diplomat who looks after China. So let me put it on the table. But you cannot compete with China on everything. And if you really want a comparison, you will find it next year when we are going to host the Commonwealth Games. And you will take a picture of the Commonwealth Games and the Olympics. You can draw your comparison. It is going to be a disaster if you ask me. And then I think India will never make the comparison with China, at least for a while. Because the comparison is really, there is a tendency in the Indian establishment and the elite and everything. So the comparison is not. But having said that, Iran is important independent of China. Qatar is important independent of that. So even if you say that China could play a role, these countries are important historically. I have a great advantage which China never had. Islam was new, it came from this region. I have a religious linkages for 13 centuries. Whether I have not used it so far. Something China is only a recent player in that area. So these countries are extremely important for us, but even China doesn't take them seriously. But the problem is competition with China increases the price. Because if you look at the Kazakhstan deal and everything, the moment China comes up, the competition goes up and the price for clinching a deal goes up. That is a flip side, you need to take care of that. But otherwise, it's China per se is not an issue in India dealing with any of these countries.
Okay, interesting. I think we're ready. Yes. Bob.
Thanks, Michael. And we've lost our microphone passer, so I'll serve that function after my question. Kumar, actually, two related questions. Recognizing that in this country, and most likely in India, elections are largely fought on local issues. Has the Middle East or some slice of that problem had any role at all in the current electioneering for your national election? And the second and related question is, let's just assume that the next government has the BJP as its leading or one of its leading parties. Can you, perhaps looking at the last time the BJP led a national government, can you predict how this might change or influence at all India's policy toward the Middle East?
Okay. If one looks at the kind of political visits to India in the last 6 months, you had the election flavor. Most of the leaders came from the Middle East, whether it's Mubarak, Rafsanjani's, Ahmadinejad's stopover. A whole range of visits were more or less linked to Middle East, came from the Middle East, which is related to the election, number one. And which everybody recognized that, it's a Congress party is starting the election campaign already. This is what people have written about it, because in December we had Turkish leader, Egyptian leader, and on top of it Amar Musa, all in a matter of 10 days. And Mubarak, for instance, could not come to India for the last 20 years. 1997 he was given the Jawaharlal Nehru Award for International Understanding. And he came only in 2008 to pick it up. Because for 12 years India was not important, he was too busy. And during that period we had two presidential visits from the United States. Every European leaders came, every Middle Eastern leaders came. Mubarak was different. But even Mubarak came, the same month about 3-4 leaders came. So the electioneering part was very much there. And if you look at the Gulf War during the Gaza crisis, some of the Indian leaders are using it in that context. Because our former Undersecretary Shashi Tharoor wrote something expressing India's close friendship with Israel, which was published in a syndicate column, but carried in Haaretz. So therefore, that became an election issue in Kerala, once he started his campaigning as a candidate. The third thing was, the Indian Union Muslim League was a member of the ruling coalition. So one of the party leaders said, Israel is a dagger in the heart of Islamic countries. So therefore, how can the government of India not take a stand against the Israeli atrocities? So he actually said, my representative should resign from the government. His representative was Ahmad, who is the junior Minister of Foreign Affairs. So there is an internal power politics within the Muslim League. But he didn't want to resign. The moment he resigns as an ordinary MP, who will take him seriously? So his power base comes from being a minister. So therefore, no, I'm satisfied with the government of India position. We issued 5 statements on the Gaza Strip. We strongly condemned Israel, which is good for me. And that is what they are saying. But right now, Indian elections are taking place in 5 different phases. And now everybody is finalizing the candidates. I would say that it is only perhaps in the middle of this month, when the finalization of candidate is done, you will have the real electioneering comes up. I am positive that somebody or the other will talk about Middle East as a major issue. The fourth thing is the Mayawati, the Bahujan Samaj Party leader, the Dalit leader, came out with election manifesto. And she said that India should follow an independent policy on Iran, should not support whatever America does. So you have certain issues largely aimed at the Muslim electorates in India. It's very clear, because if you're a democracy, you can't do it otherwise. So these are the things I would say. BJP, I hope not. Let me be very straight. I hope not, because India cannot, it's a multicultural society. You can't have an extremist position and run. And the NDA was BJP plus left, in the sense they are willing to abandon the right-wing positions. And BJP still remains a hardcore. If you look at the controversies about Varun Gandhi's statement and everything, BJP has not moved to the center. If you want to run a country like India, you need to take the center prize. If perhaps BJP minus the Hindutva could be the Congress. And that is perhaps the only way. Okay, assuming BJP becomes, in spite of everything, nothing will change. But what will change is, it was under BJP, India's relations with the Muslim countries improved tremendously. If you look at the kind of visits, we talk about energy security and everything. The Prime Minister, the President and the Vice President did not go to any Islamic countries or the Central Asian countries, except our Vice President who went to Central Asia last year. There was no official state visit by President, Vice President and everything. And Foreign Minister's visit a couple of times were cancelled because he was more important domestically. And the Foreign Minister was negotiating the nuclear deal not with the United States but with the left parties in India. That was his full-time job. So after time he was being called to do police firefighting. So he had to cancel a few visits. And if you look at BJP, it was under BJP everything improved. Today we talk about energy cooperation with Iran. It began under BJP. The red carpet welcome to Khatami happened in BJP. BJP did a great thing. In January they hosted Khatami. In September they hosted Sharon in the same year. And nobody complained. So they had a much better understanding, whatever might be the motive. With Saudi Arabia, with United Arab Emirates, with Qatar, every major Islamic countries. They improved under BJP than under Congress. Because under Congress, these guys are very busy domestic politics. They were trying to hold on to power and balancing things, something BJP did not have to do, number one. And the second thing is BJP had something to prove or disprove. No, I'm not anti-Muslim. So to prove that point, they had an enormous relationship. And these countries reciprocated. That's equally important. It's not only India wanted them, they say, okay, wait for your turn. They didn't. Saudis are equally interesting, even though, it's a right-wing Hindutva government, they were equally willing to deal with BJP. So therefore, I would not be afraid of on the BJP front. And actually, they will pay more attention to the Middle East than it deserves.
Okay, neglected to request before that you identify yourself before you ask your questions. I think you had a question over here.
Dave Ottaway, I'm a senior scholar here. In the discussion of escalating the pressures on Iran economically to try to convince them not to go nuclear, at least nuclear arms, the next step being discussed is to impose a boycott on their Iranian imports of gasoline. And it turns out that the major providers of gasoline for the Iranians are Indian companies. Now, if this comes to the fore as the next step of pressure on Iran, what do you think the Iranian government and Iranian companies would do if they were asked to stop providing gasoline to Indian companies to Iran?
It's true that last year our oil products export to Iran was $500 million. So Iran is a major supplier, and India is a major supplier. Iran is dependent on that. But on the boycott, I'm not sure how serious the United States is, because I was arguing both in public and in private. The largest instrument available to the United States is economic sanctions. They didn't use it effectively. I even suggested putting my neck on saying that all you need is, if you trade with Iran, you cannot trade with New York Stock Exchange. You can do it if you do it once, and that's the whole thing will change. I even said it to an American diplomat. That is a much better way than talking about all the surgical strike and everything. But I'm not sure how serious US is. You had a ILSA, and Congressional Research Service puts a report saying that from the time it was introduced till 2003, 11.1 billion were invested in Iran by friends of the United States. No one was taken to task. From Korea to Japan to EU to France, no one. So I'm not sure about how serious the US sanction is. Okay, I may be more vulnerable because you can't do the Japanese or you can't do the French or the Chinese and everything. I may be more vulnerable. But otherwise, I need to know that you are serious. And we know that 5 resolutions on the Security Council, each one more diluted than the previous one, and with all the rhetorical talks. So I'm not sure. Because the day everybody knows, yes, US means business, I'm going to use it, then it's a different story. I don't think we have reached there.
But would India support
Why would I? If everybody supports, maybe, if it's a sanction, and in this, why it's an individual action. It's not a UN Security Council action. Even if it's a Security Council, I'm not a member. Thank you very much. I may have to obey. I don't have to choose. This is one of the fringe benefits of not being in the high club. You can't blame me. And therefore, I'm not there. Okay, if you do it as a national policy, but then people ask a question, are you going to target only India? Or are you going to say, okay, whoever trades with Iran, I'm going to have a blacklist. These are the countries. Given the restrictions, I'm not sure about that. Whether people have the backbone for that. So this is a major problem. So economic sanction is the greatest because we know that sanctions did not work on Iraq. Yes. But in the last 15 years, we learned a lot. Okay, what are the things we did not understand? How did we fix it? I think people learned it over a period of time. And if you look at it, foreign banks actually shut down in Iran. A lot of banks were operating, and gradually they pulled out. But it was not done effectively because perhaps you do not have a point person on Iran. So therefore, every 2 months you have a different strategy. Okay, whether to talk or not to talk. Okay, depending upon which side of the bed I get up. And I am not convinced, sir, whether US is serious about an economic sanctions. If it does, perhaps yes. Because we were opposed to the sanctions. The moment the Security Council imposed sanctions on the nuclear front, we issued a statement saying, yes, it was made part of the Indian law. Okay, this is the UN Security Council. I don't accept, but this is what the world decided. We will follow it. We notified the Iranians. But we didn't do it. We did it after a day after our foreign minister came back from Iran. We didn't do it before. He came back and we said, yes, this is the UN Security Council. We need to obey it. We might do it if it's an international group. National one, I'm not sure, sir.
You, sir, had a question.
Thank you. I am Dr. Nisar Chaudhry with Pakistan American League, and I must say that it was a strategic decision that you married a Chinese. Now the relation must improve. Wonderful. The other observation you had mentioned about BJP was that it was interesting to equate it with the same example, that it was BJP which started or initiated CBMs between Pakistan and India, and it is Congress who suspended them. So things change. My question is that in this triangular relation area with India, Pakistan, and China, Pakistan are considered to be having very strategic partnership or friendship. How does and how far U.S.-Indian relations, Sino-Indian relations, impact relations of China with Pakistan and how they would influence it? And second thing is that if there is a preemptive strike in Iran, you mentioned that India needs friendship of the Muslim world as well as Iran. What kind of position do you speculate India would take in such a scenario? Thank you.
I avoided talking about Pakistan. It was not accident, it was deliberate. And if one look at it, this is part of the Indian policy after 91. And writing in 1952-53, an Israeli diplomat said Pakistan is India's center of gravity. The world begins and ends in Pakistan. India always looks at the world through Pakistan. We made a mess out of everything. Pakistan is important, but don't look at your relation with the third country through Pakistan. And we did that. And if you look at it 91 onwards, there is a gradual decision, yes, we are not going to make Pakistan as an issue in the bilateral issue. In 1986, I think the Fiji foreign prime minister came to India. There was a public statement. And one of the issue was both countries expressed concern over Pakistan's nuclear program. I said to myself, what is Fiji is to do with that? Because India demanded, Fiji put it. And I think we no longer do that. And that you recognize, especially in the Middle East, you can't. The moment you win Pakistan, you completely destroy. So you are going to deal with me, not because you are a friend of Pakistan or enemy of Pakistan, because am I relevant to you in political, economic, strategic terms. And that was a sensible thing. Because if you look at if you ask India and Pakistan, the Arab countries always say, India is a friend, Pakistan is a brother. Okay, you ask a question, who is better? Better to be a friend or a brother? If you go back to Indian mythology, actually it's better to be a friend than a brother. Because brothers always, end up in blood. So therefore, you often question that. So we don't do that. And the moment you deal in Pakistan, I'm not saying Pakistan is not important, please. Pakistan is not an issue on the table if you're talking about a bilateral issue. And that is why the relations opened. And Saudi can deal with India without worrying about Pakistan. Okay, you do with Pakistan, do it. And if you look at it, this is a strategy India is doing with Israel. In 2003, there was no reference to Pakistan or Kashmir in the Prime Minister's, in the Delhi Declaration. It was not accident, it's not a typographical. People thought, okay, you want to have relations, have it. Because the day Israel, okay, if you think that Pakistan is more important than India, be my guest. And that is a fundamental shift India had made. So this applies to China. Because it's not going to be, if the moment I get into the Pakistan thing, I'm tied down, number one. Number two, India, right or wrong, I have my own reservations personally. It's a headache, but it's okay. This is what the majority Indians view. Let me put it. We want a great power status. So then you decide, if you want a great power, you can't be talking about Pakistan and tied down to South Asia. No way. No, please help me with Pakistan. Then people ask you a question, we are a South Asian power, then stay there. Don't ask for the global stage. So if you want to play a regional role or an Asian role, you need to recognize, okay, playing the Pakistan card doesn't help. It's actually counterproductive. So don't talk about it. And I think in that context, if you look at it, it's a conscious, gradual decision. They're saying that, okay, talking Pakistan actually brings negative repercussions to me. And that is how one of the reasons we never had relations with Israel was Pakistan factor. Okay, Pakistan will play it up against the Islamic world, what happens? And when you did in 92, what happened? Next 2 months later, the Pakistani ambassador in Washington says, no, we should also do it. We should also have relations with Israel, otherwise India will get all the benefits from Israel. So, we no longer do that. So in that context, I would say that yes, Pakistan relation with the outside world is important, but that will not affect India's dealings with this country is, okay, we accept as it is, and we are not going to make that as a hostage. On the Iranian one, yes, if if a military attack, it will open a Pandora's box, because you never know where things will end up. It's completely thing. But then, Israel has, at least, one can disagree with the manner in which Israel operates at a certain level, preemptive strike, and Israelis are not fools. If you look at it, the element of surprise is gone. It was there in Iraq, it's not there. And if you look at the first statement, Saddam Hussein blamed Iran for that. Until Begin said, no, I did it. So otherwise nobody believed it. So it was Begin who confessed that I attacked. So element of surprise is gone. And the third thing is, the nuclear installations are widespread. Short of carpet bombing Iran, you can't do it. If you're talking military strategy. The only option Israel could do is a very subtle sabotage operations. But that once again can delay it. The only option available to the international community is South African role. That is, nuclear status is actually a liability for you. So best thing is roll it up. So if we can do that through a host of measures, that will be much more productive and tangible. See, no other way, because knowledge cannot be put on the battle in the bottle again. You can't. You can't roll back knowledge. You can only delay the implementation. So if you're talking about a long-term strategy, the only thing is nuclear strategy, because you want a security, but none of the countries will be secure. The moment you go nuclear, half a dozen countries around you will go nuclear. Is it worth it? I think that is perhaps the only way the international community can get there. But to do that, you need a very concerted one-point agenda. You can't just do it every 3 months, this way or that way. You can't. I don't see it. Because Iran, people are talking about a grand bargain and things, they are not looking at it in that area. So I'm not sure about whether it's going to happen. And finally, if you look at the Israeli internal debates, people who are familiar with the military operations, everyone is against that. It's only people who are not familiar who are talking about, yeah, let's go. It's like a Texan thing, let's take a trigger-happy one, let's go cowboy type. No. People who are familiar, because they know that the consequences. If you look at it, generals never commit a military operations. It is only the civilian politician who, okay, let's go for a war, because they don't know the consequences of a war. For a general, you'll have to go and give the bad news. Sorry, boy. Sorry, lady, your son is dead. A civilian never had to do the job. It's only a military guy who had to do being the messenger of death. So a general never commits his troops so easily than a civilian guy who never had an operation on the battlefield. So I'm not sure about Israel will look for that option.
We could probably take one more quick question if there was one. Yes.
Steve Cohen, Brookings. It's been a marvelous talk, and I've been scribbling notes to steal from you liberally. What I'd like to know, one thing you haven't mentioned is the Shia factor in Indian relations with the Middle East. Does the Indian Muslim community divide along sectarian lines when it comes to relations with Iran? Is that a special factor, or say Taliban? Is there a ethnic or sectarian factor in this, as well as in the next election?
Oh, my apologies. Yes, the interesting thing is the Shia-Sunni difference is always there, even though it was never given a public display. And because the bulk of the Islamic world is Sunni, and bulk of the Indian Muslim is Sunni, so if you're taking a pro-Arab policy, the Shia goes with that. The population goes with it. And similarly, if you're taking a pro-Iranian position, and Sunnis go with it. We have seen that during the Hezbollah in the Middle East. He became the more popular person among the Sunni Muslims. So you have that. But the problem is, if there is a difference between, say, Iran and Saudi Arabia, that's where the difficulty comes. And that is where you could see look at the Islamic Muslim, the Urdu press. They always make a very subtle, sarcastic observations about Iran. So, and even the Indians have publicly said, we have to talk about the Shia factor, something which we never did in the past. Because from 1947, we always said it's a secular and everything. But when you are a democratic country, you can't ignore a sizable population. Either you say, I'm not a democracy, fair enough. Or you say, I don't have a Muslim population, fair enough. Or you say, Muslims in India don't think anything beyond the borders, fair enough. None of them are true. So there is we are more and more open now. Okay, yes, let's accept it. Let's not do the pretension. And they mentioned a couple of times. Prime Minister said it in Washington in a press conference, and our National Security Advisor said it in Delhi. That yes, when you deal with Iran, there is a Shia factor. But if there is a confrontation between US and Iran, there is no difference. Everybody will argue. Shias when a difference doesn't come out. But if it comes to difference between Iran and Arab countries, then that is where you will find a visible display of the differences. And this was there even during the 80s. And much of the Shia population supported Iran, much of the Sunni population supported Saddam Hussein. You will have the division within that. But since India said no, both countries should resolve problem, it was not a major issue. But if the outside, when it comes to US and Israel, there is no difference. But when it comes to Iran and Saudi Arabia, yes, there is a difference, and they do play out. And today it's presented as confrontation between Iran and the United States. It is not presented as Iran and its Arab neighbors. And that is only an elite argument. But the mass level, they don't make that, it doesn't percolate it yet.
Well, I think, unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap things up now. But please join me in a round of applause for our speaker.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Very interesting presentation. Thank you. We're now adjourned.